One of my favorite things about St. Louis, which has now become my home for the past 2.5 years, one of the absolute best things about St. Louis for me is all the free, really great things to do in St. Louis. And one of them, my very favorite of them all, is our art museum. I don't know about you, but sometimes when I go to an art museum that I have to pay for, you know, like a $27 ticket or something, if you go to some of these big museums in big cities, you feel like you've got to just spend hour upon hour seeing every last thing in the museum, and it feels like a death march through the museum. What I love about St. Louis is I can go into the St. Louis Art Museum, and with no sense of any kind of obligation to stay longer than I want to, I can go to a single painting, and I can look at one tiny little detail of that painting, spend time with that, and that's enough. And then I can go off and I can come back, 2 days later and do it again if I want to. There's that great freedom of not having to do everything. I have the freedom to do one small little thing that helps me to see a painting in a way that I've never seen it before. Why am I telling you the story? Because that's the way that I prepared these talks for you. All of us in this room have made the exercises, which is an enormous gift. If I were proposing meditations on the Eucharist and the Passion in the context of the exercises, I would not give the person this. I prepared this material because you've made the exercises, and so we're going to go to a single painting. We're going to look at one little detail in the painting with the freedom of not having to do everything, so that hopefully what we're getting out of this is the enrichment of an angle that maybe we've never considered before without having to do the kind of broad overview of the topic that we're considering in each of these talks. I hope you'll find that as in the spirit in which it was prepared, which is the freedom to do something a little bit niche rather than trying to do the whole thing. Okay, well, let's take a look at the Eucharist. Here is, for me, one of the most surprising and fruitful ways of deepening my appreciation of the Eucharist. Here's the starting point. Typically, when we think of the Eucharist, we think of something perhaps that we consume, some means of deep union, but something, inside, internally. Perhaps something that's done together in community. All of those totally valid, all of them getting at the heart of the mystery. But St. Luke has a very interesting insight into the Eucharist, which is not one that is frequently appreciated or meditated upon. And it's that insight that I want to propose to you today, namely this, that the Eucharist is a school of the eyes. The Eucharist teaches me how to see properly, correctly, more deeply. Now, just pause there for a second. Just notice how strange and different that is. We don't typically think about the Eucharist as something to behold or that trains my eyesight. We typically think about the Eucharist as moving inside to where it becomes invisible. Again, totally legitimate. What I want to propose is this interesting insight of St. Luke's, that it also teaches me a way of seeing. It becomes a school for the eyes. So that is our orientation for this first talk. The place where we've got to start is the place where the tradition talks about us, you and me, learning to see in the wrong way. So our sight has to be trained, and it can be trained in a variety of different ways. Let's look at how the tradition treats the training of our eyesight in the wrong way. It goes straight back to Genesis 3. Now, the serpent was the most cunning of all the wild animals that the Lord God had made. He asked the woman, "Did God really say you shall not eat from any of the trees in the garden?" Of course, God did not say that. The woman answered the serpent, and here you've got to kind of hear the innocent, naive, childlike way that Eve responds to the serpent. "We may eat of the fruit of the trees in the garden. It's only about the fruit of the tree in the middle of the garden that God said, you shall not eat it or even touch it, or else you will die." You can almost hear, I think it's helpful to hear that in the way that a child reports what he or she knows. Completely transparent, no complications, no difficulties. And before we go any further, just note the strategy the evil spirit is using here to teach Adam and Eve a way of seeing. He's taken the objective situation and exactly flipped it. So what has God said? Okay, everything, I give you everything. It's just this one thing here that I'm saying, don't go over there. I'm saying it for your own good now, just like you say to a child. Don't go over there. That's the one thing. That's the only thing that's off limits. So the evil spirit's going to flip it exactly, do the mirror image, such that, in fact, what he's implying is this ridiculous, tyrannical God is saying you can't have access to any of this stuff. I mean, what do you have access to? So just notice the move, the step. But the serpent said to the woman, "You certainly will not die." God knows well that when you eat of it, and just notice this phrase, this is for Luke, this is going to be the connection. When you eat of it, your eyes will be opened. And you will be like gods who know good and evil. So, our eyesight has to be trained. What we fix our gaze on is not obvious. It's not simply there. It has to be given to us. We have to be trained. We have to be oriented to it. There's been a lot of work done in recent years on autism, as probably many of you know. And one of the things we've learned about autism is that what tends to break down there in human development is this critical response that every one of us needs in order to kind of function in an ordinary way, which is this. I have to look to someone else to be oriented to a third thing. It's my orientation to in a second personal relationship with another person that helps me to orient myself to things in the world. It's just a basic feature about humankind. There are really no other creatures that function this way. I need to see in the eyes of someone else the world. That's how I get my orientation to it. And what seems to be at work in some forms of autism is that looking to another person in order to see something about the world is not functioning the way it does in other people. Well, what's going on here is we've got a relationship now forming between Eve and the serpent that's going to teach Eve a way of seeing things in the world. But of course, it's going to be done in a way that is fractured in some sense. So, look at what happens here. Having been taught to see the world in a certain way, Eve begins to see the world in that way. So the very next paragraph here. So when the woman saw that the tree was good for food and pleasing to the eyes, and the tree was desirable for gaining wisdom, now thinking of like reasons to support this way of seeing, she took some of its fruit and ate it. I think we can say that for Adam and Eve, they have this kind of naive relationship to that which God tells them not to even focus on to begin with. They don't even really see it. They pay no time or attention to it. What the evil spirit's doing here is trying to draw their attention to it so that it comes into view this thing that they had never paid any attention to before. And once we see it, I don't think if this ever happened to you, you know you've got to, say, buy something for your house. And, okay, all of a sudden you want to buy a good version of whatever that thing is. And so you've got to do a certain amount of research. And then it turns out that you start seeing these things all over the place which you had never seen before. If this has ever happened to you. I had to buy a set of earbuds recently, the things that, to hook up to your phone so that you can hear music and etc. And I cannot tell you, I had never noticed people wearing these funny little things in their ears. I mean, a little bit behind the times on technology. I had never noticed it. Now I'm like, oh my gosh, everyone under the age of 45 has things constantly in their ears. I'd never seen it before. This is the kind of phenomenon we're talking about. When you all of a sudden train your eyesight on something, you start noticing it more and you start seeing it according to the way that it's been shown to you. That's the phenomenon that's going on here. Okay, and now Eve starts adding her own good possibility of rational thought to boost what she's seen. So she has a way of seeing it, and now all of her internal capabilities are adding onto that, and she's thinking of all the good reasons why it might be useful. She gave some to her husband who was with her, and he ate it. And here comes that same phrase again. Then the eyes of both of them were opened, and they knew that they were naked. It's ironic. So are their eyes opened or are they closed? But they've been opened. And so they sewed fig leaves together and made loincloths for themselves. Here is the clear indication that something has gone awry. When they heard the sound of the Lord God walking about in the garden, so notice a different sense. The way that they're still able to detect God's presence is no longer here, it's here. It's no longer in their eyesight, which has now been corrupted. It's in their hearing, through which faith comes. Faith comes through hearing. They can still detect God's presence. But we know that things are already disordered internally. Why? Because they hear him walking about in the garden, and they hide. They hide themselves. Now, notice what hiding does. Hiding does nothing to sound. Hiding only corresponds to sight. I try to remove myself from your sight. That's what hiding is. But of course, God's sight is not corrupted, and so that doesn't work with him. So we're trying to lay a foundation here of all that's going on in this original moment of man's education by the evil spirit, corrupting what is supposed to be senses that puts him in touch with God. So the corruption of the eyesight, the ears, the hearing remains intact, but it expresses in a desire to hide. I just tell you one story which I haven't put on the sheet here, which I love as kind of showing how this phenomenon gets undone in the scriptures. One of my favorite stories about this little man Zaccheaus. I don't know about y'all, but when I was a little kid, we learned a song about Zaccheaus. Zaccheaus was a wee little man was he? Okay, some of you know that song. He climbed up in the sycamore tree for the Lord he wanted to see. Okay, so what is Zaccheaus? Zaccheaus understands that he's got to see this person. He's got to see this one whom everyone's talked about, Christ. And he does something very foolish. He climbs up, only thinking about the fact that he wants to see. He climbs up into a position in which he can be seen by everyone. He's not desiring it. He's trying not to do it. He's not trying to make himself the center of things. All he wants to do is see Christ. But if I want to see Christ, I've got to come out of hiding. I've got to put myself in this vulnerable position where I can be seen. And so up he climbs into the tree, and now the whole village can see him. And of course, Christ can see him. This undoing of the kind of knot that the evil spirit has wanted to put in place, corrupting my eyesight, leading me to want to hide. Part of what Christ is going to have to do is to draw us out of hiding so that we can be in that vulnerable position of letting ourselves be seen, driven by this powerful desire to actually see the thing that has been lost. We'll take a look. So here's Luke's interesting insight about all of this. At the bottom of your sheet on the first page. The gospel writers have to make decisions about what stories they're going to tell and what stories they're going to leave out of the narrative. And so for that reason, there's a certain amount of differences between the four different gospels. You see this especially when it comes to the resurrection appearances. It's the weirdest part of the Bible because things don't seem to line up across the four different gospels at all. And so each of these gospel writers are having to make choices about, okay, what aspects of the resurrection appearance stories are we going to tell? And Luke is the only one who tells this precise story. And in fact, it is at the very beginning of his resurrection account. Here's what he says. That very day, the day of the resurrection, Sunday, Easter, 2 of the disciples were going to a village named Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem, and talking with each other about all these things that had happened. Just in the form of like an Ignatian composition of place, you might think about what is the spirit in which that conversation is going on. For one thing, we know already from the narrative, they're walking the wrong direction. They're walking away from the place where the definitive act in human history has happened and is still unfolding, and they're walking away from it. And they're walking away with this idea that it was all just a huge disappointment. They're dejected. You can almost imagine them kind of like dragging their feet as they go. I mean, it's an average person can walk, about 15, 20 miles in a day if you're really booking it. They're going to walk 7, and it's going to take them the whole day to do it. While they were talking and discussing together, Jesus himself drew near and went with them, but their eyes were kept from recognizing him. Interesting. So, conversation goes on. They drew near to the village to which they were going. He appeared to be going further. Why? Because he never wants to constrain us. He never wants to impose. He wants to leave us free. But they constrained him, saying, "Stay with us, for it is toward evening and the day is now far spent." So he accepts the invitation. He goes in to stay with them. When he was at table with them, he took the bread and blessed and broke it and gave it to them. And the exact phrase from Genesis 3 reappears for the first time in the Bible since Genesis 3. Their eyes were opened. So we've got bookends. Their eyes were opened, but something very strange happens. When their literal eyesight is opened, this kind of spiritual way of seeing connected to what they actually see, their eyes were opened and they recognized him, and he vanished out of their sight. We have this weird interplay again between seeing and not seeing. So think back to the garden for a second. Remember, Adam and Eve, their eyes are opened, and then they realize that they're naked. It's like their eyes are closed again in some way. They're not seeing reality. They're not seeing the truth. They're seeing something, they're seeing like a slant on it. Kind of like if any of you have young people in your life who love all these filters on like their Instagram and stuff that can turn you into a cat, just your picture immediately. This kind of thing. So there's an opening of the eyes which causes a distortion in Genesis 3. Now notice here, there's an opening of the eyes, and now something very strange happens, which is that the emphasis is no longer on what I'm literally seeing, but now a kind of deeper spiritual sight is made available to me. So seeing and not seeing. It's a very strange interplay. And this teaches them something. And here's the key thing for us. What they're seeing and not seeing teaches them something about what they have heard. That which penetrated to the core of their being, what they've heard. And they said to each other, did not our hearts burn within us while he talked with us, while we were listening to him on the road, while he opened to us the scriptures? So just notice this again. So the connection between hearing and sight. Faith comes through hearing. So how is God going to restore our sight? It's going to be through our hearing. The hearing is going to be what recalibrates our sight so that we see correctly. But the strange thing is, when we learn to see correctly, it won't necessarily be the physical sight that actually gives us the information that our spiritual eyes are receiving. It's kind of strange interplay. And what is the indication that this is a consolation they're receiving? Next paragraph. They rose that same hour and returned to Jerusalem. Now, we've just heard them say, it's so late at night, don't go out on the road. It's dark, it's dangerous, it's time for dinner. It's the end of the day. They're 7 miles from Jerusalem, which is at least 2 hours at a brisk pace on a dangerous road at night where they're hungry. But the proof of the consolation is, we have to go back to Jerusalem right now. There's no time to wait. We have the energy for it. We could do anything because we're fueled by this restoration that's taking place within us. And they go back and they say that he was known to them in the breaking of the bread. We're coming to the end of our time for this first session, so take a look just at a couple things on the back just to amplify this insight. I give this to you mainly for your own personal prayer time and for conversation with others that you might find helpful. Just to make a connection here, firstly, how do we see our sight trained by silence? Well, we see it in the Nativity. So you can think, I'm just giving you the text of a couple verses from a little town of Bethlehem. Look at the one on the right. In the night of the Nativity, how silently the wondrous gift is given. Well, are we talking about the Nativity or are we talking about the Eucharist at that point? The gift is given totally silently. In this way, God imparts to human hearts the blessings of his whole heaven. He gives it in a way that's silent, and that silence that doesn't draw attention to itself is going to be what trains me to see correctly. It's a risky strategy, and here I just want to give you the passage from Isaiah. If God's not going to draw attention to himself, if he's going to really allow you and me to go into silence, to see the gift being given in a way that doesn't draw attention to itself, if that's going to be the way that he's going to heal my way of seeing the world, there's going to be a danger that I miss it. I don't know, you probably remember this old tradition from the medieval period. Often they would ring bells at the moment of the consecration. Why? Because there's nothing else to see. You don't know that anything's happening. It just looks like the least interesting piece of bread has a few words spoken over it. There's nothing to see. So how am I going to be trained to see that God's doing the essential thing in silence, in something that draws no attention to itself? I've got to let my senses be trained in silence to see the way that God works. Here's how he works. Look at Isaiah. Who would believe what we've heard? To whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? He grew up like a sapling before him, like a shoot from the parched earth. He had no majestic bearing to catch our eye, no beauty to draw us to him. And so now we try to do as much as we can to make the liturgy as beautiful as we can, but at the heart of it remains something as simple as a piece of bread. Though harshly treated, he submitted and did not open his mouth. He doesn't speak. Like a lamb led to the slaughter or a sheep silent before shearers, he did not open his mouth. You've got some reflection questions which you're welcome to use or not use on your own to think about how are my senses trained? You and I live in a world in which things are constantly vying for our attention, and especially for our eyesight. We're so oriented toward the use of our eyes. We have to allow ourselves, and the Eucharist teaches us to do this, to let everything be brought down several notches so that in silence, where apparently nothing is given to me, the fullness of God's whole life is given to me. We have to let that kind of silent reorienting of our senses take place in the essential gift.